June 1983, Braxton County. The air was thick with the scent of cut pine and the promise of a dry summer. For most men in the county, this was a familiar and welcome smell, a sign of work and money being made at the newly reopened lumber mill on the edge of town. For Arthur Pearsall, it was something else entirely. It was a problem, or rather, the visible form of a problem he had lived with his entire life. He stood on the rise of his Westfield, a place he called the Glacial Scar. It was a 30-acre parcel of land that had broken his father's spirit and tested his own for 50 years. The soil, if one could call it that, was a pale, dense clay loam, packed hard over a bed of glacial till. It was the kind of ground that turned to greasy soup in the spring and baked into something resembling brick by August. Nothing truly thrived here. Corn grew stunted and yellowed by July. Soybeans struggled to break the crust after a hard rain. Hay was thin and weedy. Arthur was 72 years old. His hands were maps of a life spent working this land, the knuckles swollen, the palms calloused into a tough, leathery hide. He was not a large man, but he was dense with the kind of strength that came from decades of lifting, pulling, and enduring. His face was a testament to the sun and wind, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion. He never hurried, because he had learned long ago that the land did not reward haste. From his vantage point, he could see the mill a mile down the county road. A plume of fine sawdust rose from the cyclone separator, caught the prevailing west wind, and drifted like a persistent, gritty fog directly toward his property. It settled on his fences, on the leaves of the struggling alfalfa in the neighboring field, and most frustratingly, all over the barren expanse of the Glacial Scar. It was a fine pale dust, mostly pine and some oak, and it coated everything in a layer of raw, unfinished wood. The problem had started 2 years ago when a conglomerate from out of state bought the defunct mill. They had installed new, high-capacity saws and planers. They ran 2 shifts. The result was a mountain of sawdust that grew larger each day. At first, they had tried to burn it in a cogeneration plant, but environmental regulations had become stricter. Then they tried selling it for animal bedding, but the local market was quickly saturated. Now, the mountain simply grew, a testament to the relentless efficiency of modern timber processing. The wind took its share daily. Others had tried to farm the Glacial Scar. Before his father bought the parcel cheap in the 30s, a man named Henderson had gone broke trying to raise dairy cattle on it. The pasture was too poor, the ground too wet in spring, and too hard in summer for the cows' hooves. Henderson had put in drainage tile, a massive effort of hand digging and clay pipe, but the dense soil simply refused to give up its water to the drains. The tiles clogged with fine silt within a decade. Arthur's father had tried everything he knew. He had trucked in tons of lime, hoping to change the pH. He had plowed under green manure crops of buckwheat and rye. He had even, in a fit of desperation one year, tried blasting the subsoil pan with small charges of dynamite, a practice that was rumored to work but only resulted in deep, water-filled craters and a field that was impossible to plow. The failure of that field became a quiet, constant ache in his father's life. "That field's got no heart, Arthur," he would say, looking out over the pale, unproductive ground. "God left the heart out of it." Now, Arthur faced the same stubborn ground, with the added insult of the mill's endless airborne waste. He had gone to the county extension office the year before. A young man, fresh from an agricultural college, had come out. His name was Davies. He had a shiny county truck, a clipboard, and a stainless steel soil probe. He walked the field with a brisk, confident stride that told Arthur he had never had to make a living from such land. Davies took his samples, a dozen of them, plunging the probe into the hard ground with a grunt of effort. He mixed them in a plastic bucket, filled a small canvas bag, and labeled it with a black marker. He spoke of cation exchange capacity, of parts per million of phosphorus and potassium, of the benefits of no-till drilling and chemical fertilizers. He used words that felt alien to the land they were standing on. "The preliminary issue, Mr. Pearsall," Davies had said, tapping his pen on his clipboard, "is your organic matter. It's practically non-existent, less than 1%, and your pH is low. The clay content is extremely high, which is leading to severe compaction. He said it all as if he were the first person to ever notice. Arthur had simply nodded. He had known these things since he was a boy. He had known them in his bones, in the way the plow handles vibrated, in the color of the water that sat on the field for weeks after spring rain. Davies's official recommendation arrived in the mail 2 weeks later. It was a typed, multi-page report. It suggested a massive application of pelletized lime, a high-nitrogen fertilizer blend like 34-0-0, and deep subsoil ripping with a multi-shank plow. The estimated cost for the 30 acres was more than Arthur had paid for his last tractor. The report also included a final, dismissive paragraph suggesting the land might be better suited for the Conservation Reserve Program, effectively paying him to let it return to scrub. It was a polite way of saying the land was worthless for farming. The report made no mention of the sawdust. When Arthur had brought it up, Davies had waved a hand dismissively. "That's the last thing you want," he had said, a note of academic pity in his voice. "High-carbon, low-nitrogen material, like that will just lock up what little nitrogen you have in the soil. It'll acidify it further. You'll be making a bad situation worse. It creates a nitrogen deficit during decomposition. Basic soil science." Arthur folded the report and placed it in the drawer of the old roll-top desk in his study. He did not throw it away. He kept it as a record, another chapter in the long history of failed solutions for the glacial scar. The men at the co-op had their own opinions. They gathered around the wood stove in the winter and the open loading dock doors in the summer. They were men who had known Arthur his whole life. They respected him for his quiet competence, his well-maintained machinery, and the fact that he was one of the few farmers left in the county who was completely free of debt. But they saw the glacial scar as his folly, his one great stubbornness. "Heard that new mill is dustin' you out pretty good, Arthur," one of them, a man named George, had said one morning as Arthur was loading bags of mineral salt. "It settles," Arthur had replied, not looking up. "That young fella from the extension office, Davies, he was in here last week," another man chimed in, said that sawdust is poison for soil, sucks the life right out of it. There were murmurs of agreement. They were not being unkind. They were reinforcing a shared truth, a piece of conventional wisdom as solid as the concrete floor beneath their feet. Adding raw wood to a field was like adding sand to a gas tank. It was an act of agricultural sabotage. They pitted Arthur for the nuisance from a mill, and they pitted him for his stubborn attachment to a piece of land that everyone knew was good for nothing but holding the world together. Arthur finished loading his salt, paid the man at the counter in cash, and drove his old Ford pickup home. He did not engage in the debate. He did not argue or offer a contrary opinion. He had learned from his father that you did not win arguments about the land with words spoken indoors. You won them with results, measured in seasons and bushels, and often you were the only one who needed to know you had one. That evening, he did not go inside after his chores. He walked back out to the glacial scar. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pale, cracked earth. A fine layer of the day's sawdust coated the ground, filling the cracks, giving the field a strange, uniform blondness in the fading light. He knelt down and scooped up a handful of the soil. It was cool and dense. He rubbed it between his fingers. It was more like pottery clay than soil, composed of fine particles that stuck together. He could feel the grit of the sawdust mixed in. He let the soil fall from his hand and stood up, looking not at the ground, but toward the woods that bordered the north end of his property. It was an old-growth stand of maple, oak, and hickory that had never been cleared. He walked toward it, his boots making soft thuds on the hard-packed earth. As he stepped under the canopy of the trees, the air immediately changed. It grew cooler, more humid. The light softened, and the ground beneath his feet was completely different. It was soft, springy, and dark. He reached down and pushed his fingers into the forest floor. They sank in easily, past the top layer of fresh leaves, through a layer of dark, crumbly humus, into a soil that was rich, moist, and alive with the smell of earth and decay. He scraped away the leaf litter. He He saw the work of insects and fungi. He saw the white threads of mycelium stitching the soil together. He saw fallen branches, some recently fallen, others so soft with rot they crumbled at his touch, their woody forms slowly, inexorably turning into the very substance of the soil itself. It was here, in this woods, that his father had taught him about soil, not with books or reports, but with his hands and his quiet observations. He had been a boy, no more than 10 years old, complaining about the endless work of trying to farm the glacial scar. The memory was as clear as the day happened. His father had stopped their work and led him by the hand into this same woods. He had not said a word at first. He had simply knelt, just as Arthur had now, and dug his hands into the forest floor. "Feel that," his father had said. His voice was low and patient. "That's soil, real soil." Arthur had felt the cool, crumbly earth. "Now, where do you suppose it comes from?" his father had asked. "Nobody comes in here with a lime truck. Nobody plows it or spreads fertilizer from a bag. So where does it come from?" Young Arthur had looked around. "From the leaves," he had guessed. "That's part of it," his father had said, nodding. "The leaves are the blanket. But look here." He pointed to a large, moss-covered log, so old and decayed that ferns were growing from its back. He pushed his fingers into it, and the wood came away like moist cake. It was dark, almost black, and smelled of mushrooms and damp earth. This was an oak tree once. Stood right here for 200 years. A storm took it down before I was born. Now what is it? "It's a rotten log," Arthur had said. "It's soil," his father corrected gently. "It's soil in the making. The forest doesn't waste a thing, son. Not a leaf, not a branch, not a whole tree. It takes its time. It turns wood back into dirt. It builds its own heart, right here on the spot." He had picked up a handful of the rotting wood and the dark soil beneath it. The men at the university, they talk about chemistry. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They're not wrong, but they're missing the biggest part of the recipe. They think soil is a thing you have, a resource. But it's not. Soil is a process. It's a thing that happens, not a thing you find. It's a verb. The forest is soiling. All the time. And the main ingredient, he held up a piece of the soft, punky wood, is this. Carbon. Plain old wood. That was the core principle. The central thesis of his father's understanding. The problem isn't the wood, Arthur. The problem is always time. People are in too much of a hurry. They throw sawdust on a field and expect corn to grow next spring. The land doesn't work on that schedule. You give wood to the soil, you have to give it time, and you have to give a partner. Arthur stood up from his spot in the woods, the memory settling over him not as a wave of nostalgia, but as a clear and solid instruction. He looked back out at the glacial scar, shimmering under the rising moon. He saw the pale clay. He saw the coating of sawdust from mill. He saw the problem that had vexed 2 generations of his family. But now he saw it through his father's eyes. He did not see a barren field being polluted by industrial waste. He saw the delivery of the main ingredient. He kept a set of notebooks, just as his father had. Small, black, cloth-bound ledgers. In them, he recorded rainfall, planting dates, harvest yields, observations about wildlife. That night, he opened the current one. The pages were filled with his neat, blocky handwriting. He turned to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. June 14th, 1983. Below it, he wrote sawdust, carbon. He paused, then added nitrogen partner required, manure, legumes, and finally, the most important ingredient, time, estimated 5 to 7 years. The math did not require a pencil. The mill produced hundreds of tons of sawdust a year. They considered it a liability, a waste product they had to pay to dispose of. He had 30 acres of carbon-starved clay. The 2 problems, when placed side by side, looked to him like 2 halves of a solution. A very large, very slow solution. The next morning, he drove his pickup not to the co-op, but to the mill. The new manager was a man named Henderson, the grandson of the man who had gone broke on the glacial scar. He was a man who wore a hard hat and carried a clipboard, but his eyes held a weariness that Arthur recognized. He was a man with a problem he couldn't solve. Arthur found him by the base of the sawdust mountain. It was even larger up close, a steep-sided, pale yellow monolith that smelled sharply of resin. Small avalanches of it would periodically break free and slide down its face. "Mr. Pearsall," Henderson said, shouting over the whine of the saws. "That wind is a nuisance, I know. We're doing what we can. Thinking of putting up a screen fence." Arthur shook his head. "I'm not here to complain," he said. His voice was quiet, and Henderson had to lean in to hear him. "What can I do for you, then?" "I want your sawdust," Arthur said. Henderson stared at him. He thought he had misheard. "You want it?" "All of it," Arthur said. "The pile you have now, and what you make from now on." "What on earth for?" Henderson asked, a look of genuine bewilderment on his face. "I have a place for it," Arthur said simply. Henderson considered the offer. His company was currently paying a local trucker a handsome sum to haul the sawdust to the county landfill, where they were charged a tipping fee. It was a significant line item on his operational budget. The idea of someone taking it for free seemed too good to be true. "You'll haul it yourself?" Henderson asked, skeptical. "I will," Arthur confirmed. "And you won't charge me?" "You won't charge me," Arthur countered. A slow grin spread across Henderson's face. He was being offered a free solution to his biggest headache. He didn't care if the old man wanted to build a pyramid out of it. "Mr. Pearsall," he said, extending a dusty hand. "You've got a deal." Arthur shook his hand. The deal was done. He did this quietly. He did not announce it at the co-op. He did not call Mr. Davies at the extension office to tell him he was about to defy his expert advice. He simply went home and prepared his equipment. His primary tool was not a modern, high-horsepower tractor. It was a 1948 Allis-Chalmers Model G. It was a small, peculiar-looking machine, with its engine mounted in the rear and a set of cultivating tools placed in front of the operator for clear visibility. Most farmers had long since relegated these tractors to garden duty or sold them for scrap. But Arthur kept his in perfect condition. He had rebuilt the four-cylinder Continental engine himself. He knew its every bolt and wire. The Model G had two critical advantages for the task ahead. First, it was extremely lightweight. With him on the seat, it weighed less than 1,400 pounds. It would not compact the already dense clay of the glacial scar. It would tread lightly, even when pulling a load. Second, its small engine was remarkably fuel efficient. The work ahead would involve hundreds, perhaps thousands, of hours of tractor time. Fuel cost was a factor. His other main tool was an old New Idea Model 10 manure spreader. It was a ground-driven machine, simple and nearly indestructible. He had bought it at an auction for $50 20 years ago. He spent a week in his workshop modifying it. He took off the beater bars at the back, the ones designed to shred and fling manure. He welded on a new set of angled fins, designed not to shred, but to guide the sawdust out in a wide, even sheet. He greased the apron chain and oiled the gears. He began the work on a Monday in late June. The process was simple and brutally repetitive. He would drive his Ford F-250, a 1978 model with a stout flatbed, to the mill. Henderson had given him full access to the pile. He used the mill's small front-end loader, a tired old Massey Ferguson, to load the sawdust onto his truck. The sawdust was light but bulky. He could haul about 2 tons per trip. He would drive the load back to his farm and dump it at the edge of the glacial scar, creating his own, smaller mountain. Then he would get on the Allis-Chalmers G, hitch up a small front-end loader of his own, and begin transferring the sawdust from the pile into the modified manure spreader. Then the spreading began. He drove the little tractor back and forth across the pale, hard field, the spreader laying down a thick, even blanket of raw wood fiber. The G's engine puttered along, a quiet, steady sound in the vast emptiness of the field. He worked in lands, just as he would if he were plowing, ensuring complete coverage. The first layer was 6 inches deep. It completely covered the pale clay. The 30-acre field was transformed into a vast, blonde desert. It looked utterly alien, an unnatural landscape of uniform color and texture. The news of his project traveled quickly through the community. People would slow their cars as they drove past on the county road, staring at the bizarre sight. The men at the co-op no longer pitied him. They were convinced he had finally lost his mind. "He's mulching the whole farm," George said, shaking his head. 30 acres of it, turning it into a tinderbox. My grandpa told me a story about a fella who tried that back in the Depression, another added. Field didn't grow a decent crop for 20 years. It would sour the ground. Mr. Davies, the extension agent, drove by one afternoon while Arthur was working. He pulled his county truck onto the shoulder and got out. He stood with his hands on his hips, a look of profound disbelief on his face. He watched Arthur on his little tractor, patiently spreading the golden dust. Davy shook his head and got back in his truck. He did not stop to talk. From his perspective, there was nothing to say. He was witnessing a man engaged in a deliberate, large-scale act of agricultural suicide, based on what could only be ignorance or senility. Arthur saw them all. He saw the pointing fingers, the shaking heads. It did not affect him. He was not operating on their timeline or according to their books. He was working from a different set of instructions, given to him in a quiet woods a lifetime ago. His father's words were his guide. The problem isn't the wood. The problem is always time, and you have to give a partner. He finished spreading the first 6-inch layer by the end of the summer. He had hauled and spread over 4,000 tons of sawdust. The mountain at the mill was smaller, but still immense. His own pile was gone. The glacial scar was gone, buried. Now, he needed the partner. The nitrogen. He found it in 2 forms. The first was from a large poultry operation 2 counties over. They had mountains of chicken manure, rich in nitrogen, that they had to get rid of. Like the mill, they were happy to have someone haul it away for free. The process began again, but this time with a different material. The manure was denser, heavier, and smelled powerfully of ammonia. He used the unmodified manure spreader for this, laying a 2-inch layer of the dark, pungent material over the top of the blonde sawdust. The field now looked like a giant, 30-acre sheet cake with a layer of chocolate frosting. The sight was even more bizarre than before and did nothing to quell the local gossip. With the carbon and the first source of nitrogen in place, he needed to mix them. He used a heavy-duty disc harrow, pulling it with his larger tractor, a 1965 John Deere 4020. He had to go over the field 6 times to incorporate the manure and sawdust into the top few inches of the dense clay. The 4020's diesel engine roared under the strain, the discs churning the layers together into a strange, fibrous, mottled mixture. That fall, as the autumn rains began, he planted the second part of his nitrogen partner. He broadcast a heavy seeding of hairy vetch and winter rye. These were cover crops, not meant for harvest. Their job was to grow, to fix atmospheric nitrogen in their roots, and to protect the surface from erosion over the winter. They would be the living part of the partnership. The first year ended. The field went into winter looking brown and fibrous, with a faint green haze as the rye and vetch began to sprout. The next spring, year 2, the rye and vetch grew thick and tall. In May, before they could go to seed, he plowed it all under. He used his old moldboard plow, the one his father had used. The plowshares, polished to a mirror shine by years of use, had a hard time scouring in the woody, loose mixture, but they did the job. They turned the green matter and the sawdust manure mix under, bringing the pale clay back to the surface. The field looked wounded, a chaotic mess of clay clods, straw-like sawdust, and wilting green vetch. It looked worse than it ever had before. But Arthur knew the real work was now happening beneath the surface. The bacteria, the fungi, the microbes, they now had everything they needed. They had the immense banquet of carbon from the sawdust. They had the readily available nitrogen from the manure. They had the fresh, green nitrogen from the vetch. Now, they would begin their slow, invisible work of decomposition. They would begin to build a heart for the field. The process was repeated. He hauled more sawdust, another 4,000 tons. He laid it down. He hauled more manure. He laid that down. He dished it all in. He planted another cover crop, this time a mix of clover and oats. He fell into a rhythm that spanned the seasons. Summer was for hauling and spreading. Fall was for seeding the cover crop. Spring was for plowing it all under. He did this for 4 consecutive years. Each year, he added another 6 inches of sawdust, another 2 inches of manure, and a thick stand of green matter. He was not farming the topsoil. He was building it layer by layer. He He was adding nearly 2 feet of raw organic material to the top of the barren clay. During these years, he became a fixture, a curiosity. The story of Old Man Pearsall's sawdust field became a piece of local folklore. People would bring visitors to see it. He never acknowledged them. He just kept working, his little Alice Chalmers G puttering back and forth, a small, determined figure in a vast, strange landscape of his own making. The financial aspect was not lost on him. He tracked his expenses in his ledger. His fuel costs for the hauling and spreading were significant, but manageable. The raw materials, the sawdust, and the manure were free. The cover crop seed was his only other major expense. Mr. Davies's recommended chemical solution would have cost him tens of thousands of dollars up front. Arthur's investment was primarily his own time, his own fuel, and his unshakable patience. He was trading his labor and the running hours of his old machines for a chance to solve a problem that money had never been able to fix. By the beginning of the 5th year, he noticed the first real signs of change. It wasn't something you could see from the road. It was something you felt. When he walked on the field, the ground no longer felt hard and unyielding. It had a slight spring to it. When he drove the John Deere over it to plow, the tractor's tires sank in slightly, not from mud, but from the sheer volume of decomposing matter. He stopped one day in the middle of the field and got a spade from the toolbox on the tractor. He pushed it into the ground. For his entire life, getting a spade into the glacial scar had required putting a boot on the shoulder of the blade and throwing his full weight onto it. Now, it slid in easily with a soft, tearing sound. He leveraged a spadeful of the soil and lifted it out. He knelt to examine it. The clear, stratified layers of his applications were gone. The sawdust, the manure, the clay, the green matter, they were no longer distinct. They had been blended by the plow, by the rain, and most importantly, by the invisible life in the soil. The color was no longer pale gray or blonde. It was a deep, rich, crumbly brown, the color of coffee grounds. He broke the clod apart with his hands. It was teeming with earthworms, not the small, pale worms he occasionally saw before, but large, robust night crawlers, their glistening bodies twisting through the dark matrix. He had not introduced them. They had come on their own, a volunteer army drawn to the feast he had laid out for them. Their burrows were aerating the soil, their castings were enriching it. They were the gut of his new earth. He picked up a handful. It smelled like the forest floor. The sharp, resinous smell of the raw pine sawdust was gone. The acrid ammonia smell of the manure was gone. They had been transformed into the clean, sweet smell of healthy, living soil. He crumbled it in his palm. It held together when he squeezed it, but fell apart into soft aggregates when he poked it. It was the perfect texture. It was what his father had called real soil. He knew then that the building phase was over. The 5th year would not be for adding more. It would be for resting and planting. He did not plant a cash crop. Not yet. He planted the field in a deep-rooted perennial, alfalfa. The alfalfa's roots would drive deep, breaking up the clay subsoil pan that dynamite had failed to conquer. They would act as biological drills, creating channels for air and water to penetrate deeper than the plow had ever reached. The alfalfa would also fix more nitrogen, a final, slow-release dose for the maturing soil. He took a hay cutting off it that summer. The stand was so thick and tall his swathers struggled to get through it. The yield was astonishing. He got 3 tons to the acre on the first cutting from land that had previously struggled to produce a single ton of weedy grass in a whole season. He sold the hay to a neighboring dairy farmer, the first income the glacial scar had produced in his lifetime. The cash was welcome, but it was secondary. The real profit was in the vibrant green of the field and the health of the soil beneath it. It was the following spring, the beginning of the 6th year, when Mr. Davies returned. The county was doing a new soil survey, updating their maps for the first time in 20 years. Davies was in charge of it. He was driving down the county road when he passed Arthur's farm. He slowed, then stopped. The field that had been a bizarre, sawdust-covered wasteland for years was now a uniform, lush green. It was the most vibrant field in the entire county. It stood out against the paler greens of the neighboring corn and hay fields like an emerald on a blotter. Davies got out his truck. He leaned against the fence, staring. It made no sense. His textbooks, his training, his entire understanding of soil science told him this field should be sterile, acidic, and dead. It should be a monument to a fool's errand. Instead, it was radiating vitality. He saw Arthur out on the field, walking through the alfalfa, and drove his truck down the long lane to the farmhouse. Arthur saw him coming and waited by the barn. Davies got out his truck. He looked older than Arthur remembered. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a look of profound, troubled curiosity. He held a soil probe in his hand, but he wasn't brandishing it like a symbol of authority anymore. "Mr. Pearsall," he said, "I'm doing the new county survey. I need to take a sample from this parcel." "Go ahead," Arthur said. Davies walked out into the field. Arthur watched him. The young man pushed the probe into the ground. It slid into its full depth with almost no effort. Davies's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He pulled out the core. He stared at it. The top 18 inches were not clay. They were a black, friable loam, shot through with roots and the dark channels of worm burrows. Below that, the pale clay subsoil was visible, but it too was darker than he remembered, and it was fractured with root penetration. He took a dozen more samples, his movements becoming more and more agitated. He mixed them in his plastic bucket. The material was nothing like the hard, pale clay he had collected 6 years earlier. This was textbook topsoil, the kind of material farmers dreamed of. He walked back to Arthur, holding out a handful of the new soil. "How?" he asked. The single word was a surrender. It was an admission of ignorance, a plea for an explanation that his science could not provide. "I wrote a report on this field. I said it was impossible. I told my superiors that what you were doing would ruin this land for a generation. I used it as a case study in my training seminars for new agents, an example of what not to do." Arthur looked at the soil in the young man's hand. He did not smile. He did not say, "I told you so." He felt no need for triumph. The field itself was the only statement that mattered. "My father taught me," Arthur said, his voice quiet. "He said the forest builds its own soil out of wood. I just copied the recipe." He then explained, in plain, unadorned language, what he had done. He spoke of the carbon in the sawdust. He spoke of the nitrogen in the manure and the cover crops. He explained the concept of the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio not as a chemical formula, but as a partnership. The sawdust was the house, he said. The nitrogen was the food for the workers. The worms and the microbes were the workers. All I did was supply the materials and the time. Davies listened, his face a mask of concentration. He was connecting Arthur's simple, practical explanation to the complex biological and chemical cycles he had learned in college. He was seeing the theory made real, on a scale he had never imagined. The nitrogen deficit he had warned about was not a permanent state of poisoning. It was a temporary hunger, the massive energy draw required by the microbial workforce to break down the carbon. Arthur had provided more than enough food to satisfy that hunger and have plenty left over. "You composted an entire field," Davies said, the scale of it finally dawning on him. "You built 18 inches of topsoil from scratch." "The land did the building," Arthur corrected. "I just hauled the logs." Davies filled his sample bag with the new soil and labeled it. He knew what the lab results would say. The organic matter would be off the charts, probably 15% or higher. The nutrient levels would be staggering. The pH would be perfectly balanced. He had witnessed a miracle of soil regeneration, and the man who had performed it had used industrial waste, animal waste, and a set of antique farm machines. The results came back a week later. Davies drove them out to the farm himself. He didn't mail them. He sat with Arthur at his kitchen table and laid the two reports side by side, the one from 1981 and the new one from 1987. The numbers were a stark, undeniable testament to the transformation. Organic matter had gone from 8% to 162%. Available nitrogen had increased by a factor of 30. Phosphorus and potassium were now in the optimal range. The cation exchange capacity, a measure of the soil's ability to hold nutrients, had increased tenfold. It was no longer clay loam. The lab had classified it as a silta loam, one of the most productive soil types in the world. By every metric we have, Davies said, his voice full of a new, quiet respect, this is now the most fertile piece of land in Braxton County, possibly in the entire state. He paused, then looked at Arthur. I was wrong, he said. The words were simple, direct, and honest. Everything I thought I knew told me you were wrong. But you weren't. You were just working on a different time scale. That year, Arthur plowed down the alfalfa. The ground turned over in long, dark, fragrant ribbons. The John Deere pulled the plow with ease. He planted the field in potatoes, a crop he knew would showcase the soil's quality. The plants grew with a vigor he had never seen. The vines were thick and deep green, the blossoms plentiful. When he harvested in the fall, the results were stunning. The potato digger unearthed a river of clean, uniformly sized tubers. There was no rot, no scab, no sign of disease or stress. The yield was quantified, and it was as shocking as the soil report. He harvested over 600 bushels per acre. The county average was less than 300. The success was absolute and undeniable. It was measured in tons and bushels and dollars. The income from that single potato crop was more than the glacial scar had been worth in its entirety 6 years before. The story of his success spread, but this time it was different. The gossip at the co-op was no longer about his foolishness, but about his genius. The laughter was replaced by a kind of awed respect. The men who had shaken their heads in pity now asked him for advice. Arthur would just nod and say, "The land tells you what it needs if you listen." Mr. Davies became a frequent visitor. He was no longer an agent coming to give advice, but a student coming to learn. He wrote a new report, a formal retraction of his earlier one. He detailed Arthur's methods and the astonishing results. He called it the Pearsall method of whole field composting. His report was published in a statewide agricultural journal. Extension agents from other counties started calling him, then visiting Arthur's farm. They would walk the field, now called Pearsall's loam by the locals, taking notes, marveling at the dark, deep soil. The institutional knowledge was forced to change, to expand its understanding to include a truth it had previously dismissed. The mill manager, Henderson, also came to see him. His company was still producing a mountain of sawdust. "I've been hearing stories," he said to Arthur, "about what you did with all that. Waste." "It wasn't waste," Arthur said. "It was an ingredient." A young man was with Henderson that day. His name was Hayes, a new forestry graduate Henderson had just hired. He was quiet, observant, and he listened intently as Arthur explained his process. He did not have the arrogant confidence of the young Mr. Davies. He had a look of genuine curiosity. Arthur saw something in the young man's eyes. He saw the potential for understanding. He took them into his house, to the old roll-top desk. He pulled out one of his father's notebooks, the one from 1938. He opened it to a page where his father had sketched the layers of the forest floor, from the fresh leaves on top to the dark humus below. Beside the sketch were his father's words, "The forest builds its own dirt. We just have to learn its recipe." Young Hayes stared at the page, at the old-fashioned cursive and the simple, profound drawing. He looked from the notebook to Arthur. He knew this back then. He knew. Arthur confirmed. The knowledge was always there. People just stopped listening to it. This was the passing of the torch. Henderson, inspired by the conversation and by Davies's report, started a new program at the mill. They would no longer send their sawdust to the landfill. They would offer it, for free, to any farmer who agreed to follow the Pearsall method. They even helped coordinate with the poultry farm to create a ready supply of the nitrogen partner. Young Hayes was put in charge of the program. He became a regular visitor to Arthur's farm, learning the practical details, the feel of the soil, the rhythm of the work. He was the successor, the one who would carry the knowledge into the future. Years passed. The glacial scar, now Pearsall's loam, became an accepted, respected part of the local geography. Its fertility was no longer remarkable. It was simply a fact. Other farmers in the county began to adopt Arthur's method on their own poor fields, their own glacial scars. The slow, patient work of rebuilding the soil began to spread. The pale, Unproductive patches of the county map began, slowly, to turn a darker, more fertile brown. Arthur continued to farm it, rotating his crops, always planting a cover crop in the winter, always feeding the soil that he had built. He never expanded. He never went into debt. He lived his life with the same quiet satisfaction he had always known, but now it was tinged with the peace of a problem correctly and completely solved. One evening, in his 90s, he stood again on the rise, looking out over the field. It was planted in corn that year, and the stalks stood 10 feet tall, their leaves a deep, healthy green. He thought of his father and the sadness that field had caused him. He thought of the young extension agent and his confident dismissal. He thought of the men at the co-op and their well-meaning pity. He looked down at his old Alice Chalmers G, parked in the barn, still clean, still ready to work. It was a symbol, he thought, of his father's wisdom. It was not big or powerful or new, but it was the right tool for the job. It was patient. It was light on the land. It had understood the task at hand. The soil, he knew, was the ultimate ledger. It kept a perfect record. It did not care about theories written in books or opinions spoken in diners. It cared only for what it was given. It remembered the carbon of the sawdust, the nitrogen of the manure, the life of the clover. It remembered the patience. Some things did not become obsolete. They simply waited for people to remember why they worked.